Now we're going to focus on the skeletal system. We're going to introduce the basic layout of the skeletal system, and then we're going to focus on structure, classification, and articulation. Now, one thing I need you to remember from when we discussed the different tissues of the body, osseous or osteo refers to bone. Now, the skeletal system is going to be an interconnected system, primarily of bones, but it also includes cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. The skeletal system will mainly provide support. It is the center or central axis that the muscles attach to act on to create motion. The skeletal system is a form of protection. It acts as a barrier to protect vital organs such as the brain, the spinal cord, the heart, the lungs, and the kidneys. The skeletal system is composed of 206 bones of the body. The skeletal system is divided into two main parts, the axial and appendicular skeleton. The skeletal system holds about 20 to 40% water. Some resources say 22%, while others say about 35%. The skeletal system is extremely strong, but yet it's also very flexible. The skeletal system makes up almost 1/5 of the healthy body's weight. As you can see here on the left is the axial skeleton, which is primarily the skull, hyoid bone, vertebrae, rib cage, sternum. And then we have the appendicular skeleton, which are primarily the arms, legs, so the appendages, so the limbs, as well as the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle or pelvis. And as we said, there was 206 bones of the body. 80 of them are going to be in the axial skeleton, while 126 are going to be in the appendicular skeleton, 64 being in the upper appendicular, so the upper arms, and 62 in the lower appendicular skeleton, or the lower limbs. 6 of the 206 bones are the middle ear bones or middle ear ossicles. So let's talk about bone structure. Now, as we talked about in the previous chapter on tissues, basically there are different connective tissues such as bone, adipose, cartilage, and blood. Now, this specific connective tissue that we're going to talk about, as we already know, is the bone. Now, the structural unit or the circular unit of the bone is called the osteon, and the osteon is basically found in compact bone. Now, the center of the osteon is the Haversian canal, and this structure, this canal, contains blood vessels and nerves and allows the bone to receive oxygen and nutrition or nutrients through the blood vessels. The blood vessels are going to be so tiny at this point, but the spaces that branch off from the Haversian canal are even smaller, too small, in which the capillaries can't pass through. So what we're going to do is we're going to carry these nutrients or waste through the cytoplasm. This cytoplasmic process spreads through these little canals. So you can actually see that from the Haversian canal, that main circle, there are rings. These rings are called the lamellae. These ring matrix contains these dark little spots going along in the rings. These dark spots are called lacunae. Now, the lacunae are spaces that hold the osteocytes. Now, remember, osteo means bone, cyte means cell. So these bone cells actually respond to the physical strain of the bone. They send signals throughout the bone, and they actually work with formation or breakdown of the bone. And there are two types of osteocytes, the osteoblast and the osteoclast. Connecting each of these rings are these little rings are called canuliculi, and the canuliculi carry the cytoplasm of nutrients or waste from one ring to another, to one osteocyte to another. So we have the osteon, the Haversian or osteonic canal, the lamellae, the lacunae, which holds the osteocyte, and then we have the cannuliculi, which are the connection between the rings. So let's take a look. You can see the lacunae, which is the space. The osteocyte is within the space. The cannuliculi, which are these little pathways or little canals connecting each of the rings or lamellae. And then you can see the center haversional or osteonic canal. And then we have the whole complete osteon. Now, as we said, there are two types of bone cells. There's the osteoclast and osteoblast. Now, one way you can remember this is that osteoblast, B for blast, it builds. So osteoblast will build the bone cell. Now, the osteoclast will perform resorption, which is basically a remodeling or a breakdown of the bone. Now, the problem is when you have a hormonal change, such as maybe pregnancy, the osteoclast will break down or resorb the bone mineral. When someone is maybe pregnant, they will, where the baby is requiring calcium, the body will, these osteoclasts may break down the bone to get the calcium to the baby. That's why it's very important to take medication or prenatal vitamins so you're getting enough calcium so you're not breaking down the bone to provide that for the baby. So there's two basic types of bone tissue. We have the compact bone or cortical bone. And the compact bone is the dense bone that contains the osteons, while the spongy bone or cancellous or trabecular bone contains many different holes or pores. This porous type of bone has a lot of blood vessels, it's very vascularized, and contains red bone marrow. So where there's a lot of spongy bone, there's going to be the red bone marrow. This is going to be where you have the production of the blood cells, such as red blood cells, white blood cells, and the platelets or thrombocytes, which produce the scab. So that's all going to be created at the red bone marrow. Now, these spaces may actually become larger when there's osteoporosis or the osteoclast breaking down the bone more than what it should be. So we can see at the bottom here, we can see the osteon and the osteocytes. And here you can actually see the normal spongy bone versus or compared to the osteoporosis of the spongy bone. And osteoporosis, osteo meaning bone, pore referring to porous. So the porous bone makes the bone very brittle. And this isn't just in those who are elderly. I mean, this does begin when someone is younger, but you don't really see the signs of this, that you're not getting enough calcium until you're older. And that's why when you do break a bone, it is very evident. So it's very important to take calcium, vitamin D when you're younger or when you start going through a hormonal change. Now we're going to be talking about the long bone later on and in our next lecture video, but let's talk about the parts. Now the epiphysis or epiphysis, epi meaning on top, this is going to be the ends of the long bone. The epiphyseal plate is the growth plate. This is primarily hyaline cartilage, and most bone or all bone primarily comes from or develops at birth from hyaline cartilage. So we talked about achondroplasia or dwarfism. So there's a genetic disorder of the growth plate or the cartilage in the development of the long bones. Now the diaphysis is the main body of the long bone, and that's going to be the part that the dog bites and carries. But this is primarily made up of the compact bone that we've talked about before. This more solid compact bone is going to be covered by the periosteum, which is the covering of the long bone. And then you have inside the long bone or between the compact bone, you have yellow bone marrow. Now, this yellow bone marrow is going to be primarily fat. So we do have the red bone marrow, and the red bone marrow is going to be primarily found in the spongy bone, kind of on the ends, while there is a little bit of spongy bone going down, but primarily the center of the long bone, you're going to have the yellow bone marrow. And this is the medullary cavity, and this hollow cavity is filled with bone marrow. And as you can see here, this is what we were talking about, the formation of the long bone. You can see the large amount of cartilage. That hyaline cartilage then develops into the structure of the bone. So we have ossification, which is the formation of bone. And we can see the difference between the child as the child develops and grows. And it's vital there at that growth plate. And then we have some connective tissues such as the ligament, cartilage, and the tendon. Now, the ligaments and cartilage are primarily part of or considered definitely part of the skeletal system. Tendons, however, are more considered part of the muscular system. Ligaments are the fibrous connective tissue, the dense connective tissue that connects bone to bone. Cartilage wraps around the bone to prevent impact, to more cushion. We learned that the hyaline cartilage is primarily at the ends of the bone. This is also called articular cartilage. And then we learned about fibro or fibrous cartilage, and that's actually between the vertebrae. So we did talk about that in the last chapter. And then you have tendons, which is the connective tissue that binds bone to muscle. Now let's talk about bone classification. We said there were 206 bones in the body. There's 22 in the skull, 33 in the vertebral column, so your vertebrae. And remember, the vertebrae protects the spinal cord. Then we have the shoulder girdle and upper limbs, so the arms, 64 bones. And then the pelvic girdle, the pelvis, and the legs or lower limbs, 62 bones. And then we have 25 bones in the thoracic cage, and that's including the ribs. Now, as we kind of already talked about the long bone a little bit before, but there are 5 classification types. There's long bones, which include the femur, the humerus of the arm, the radius, ulna, tibia, fibula. We have flat bones, which primarily are making up the skull. The sesamoid bones include the patella, which is the kneecap. And then we have short bones, which make up the bones of the wrist and the ankle. These are the carpals and the tarsals. And then we have irregular shaped bones, which are the vertebrae, as well as the hyoid, which is in the neck, kind of near the Adam's apple. So you can see here's the axial skeleton. We have the head, neck, and trunk of the body. So we have the skull, the hyoid bone. You can see that it's kind of near the thyroid, the larynx. The hyoid bone really doesn't have any articulation or connection with any other bone. We have the vertebral column. We have the thoracic cage, which are 12 pairs of ribs. We have the sternum, which is the breastplate or the breastbone. And then we have the auditory ossicles, which are the malleus, incus, and stapes. And we said we have 2 pairs of the auditory ossicles. Then with the appendicular skeleton, we have the limbs and girdles. That's going to be primarily the hand, arm, foot, legs. So these appendages coming off of the shoulder and pelvic girdles. And we're going to talk about this now we're going to learn about the specific bones in the future. So this is just a little preview for you, maybe a good little bonus, but we're going to learn about this in a future lecture. We have the humerus, which is the upper arm bone. And then we have the radius and ulna. The ulna primarily makes up the elbow. The radius is larger at the wrist, and that is primarily going to be important when we talk about the radial pulse. Then we have the leg bone, which is the femur connecting to the hip or the pelvis. Then we have the tibia, which is the shin bone, and then we have the fibula. Since we're talking about leg bones, we have a lot of different bone fractures. There's a lot of different types that we can talk about. One of them that you don't see here is a compound fracture. A compound fracture is when the bone rips out of the flesh, comes out of the body. But these are going to be primarily the ones that maybe are more common, specifically the green stick break and the transverse fracture. So the green stick fracture is an incomplete fracture. So it doesn't break all the way. It breaks partially. So that's a very common one. I broke 6 bones in my body, and majority of them were green stick breaks. The transverse fracture is a complete fracture that's going to break all the way. So those are going to be the main two, the green stick and the transverse, that I'm going to talk about. But if you ever hear about a compound fracture, that's when the bone comes out of the body. I won't show you any pictures, but you can actually, if you want to, look that up with a parent. You can see on the left, we have a transverse fracture, and then the 2 slender pictures in the middle are your green stick fractures, which aren't complete. And then we have on the right just a little fun Photoshop. So we have the long bone, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and then we also said the sesamoid bones. And there are 3 main types of articulations or joints. There's the synarthrotic articulation, which is a non-movable articulation. This is the little sutures in the skull. This connects the flat bones of the skull. And we'll look at what the sutures look like later on, but this connects the different bones of the skull. Then we have the amphiarthrotic articulation, and that's a slightly movable joint. That's going to be like the vertebrae. Then we have the diarthrotic articulation, and that's a freely movable articulation. These articulations or joints are called synovial joints, and there are 6 types. Generally, depending on different resources, you may only see maybe the top 4. Some resources just focus on the top 4 types or the most common. We're going to include all 6 so that you're aware of them. But we have the pivot joint, we have the hinge joint, the saddle joint, the gliding joint or plane joint, and then we have the ellipsoidal or ellipsoid or the condyloid joint, which if you think about what an ellipse is, basically we have a curved little pattern as it kind of moves back and forth on that curved end of the bone, such as the radius, as it interacts with the carpals of the wrist. Then we have the ball and socket. So if you look at the picture, the illustrations, we have the pivot joint. The pivot joint allows us to rotate back and forth, to kind of pivot. If you think about basketball, you pivot on one foot, you kind of rotate around. That's going to be seen in the neck, but also in the arm as you flip over your palm from facing down to facing up. You have the hinge joint, which is like the elbow and the knee. It's kind of like the hinge of a door opening and closing. Then we have the saddle joint. The saddle joint is primarily found in the carpals and metacarpals. If you think about a saddle, this is going to be if you remember, if you ever learned the words convex and concave, concave is a curved inward structure while convex is curved outward. So these 2 bones, one's concave and one is convex, they kind of fit in to each other, and they slightly move back and forth and kind of around as they kind of fit into each other. So this is primarily found in the wrist, structures to the fingers. Then we have the gliding or plane joint. This is like a sliding joint, and this is primarily found in the tarsals or bones of the foot. And then we have the ellipsoid, which we talked about already. Then we have the ellipsoid joint, which is a slightly curved structure as it rotates on elliptical structure of the curved end of the radius as it connects and interacts with the carpal bones of the wrist. And then lastly, we have the ball and socket, which is primarily identified or seen in the humerus hooking to the pectoral girdle, which is the shoulder girdle, as well as the femur hooking in to the pelvic girdle or the pelvis. Because we're talking about synovial joints, there's synovial fluid, which is a fluid that lubricates the joints, allowing it to freely move. Since we're talking about the joints and the articulations, we did talk about rheumatoid arthritis already. Arthritis usually affects the joints. This not only creates pain, swelling, stiffness, but also deformity in the later stages.